Hidden among the ranches and rolling hills in the northern part of Denton County, Texas, the remains of more than 400 people lie in an overgrown cemetery. And even though it was abandoned and forgotten a long time ago, a few headstones can still be found. But most of the graves in this place never had a marker to begin with. That's because the people who were buried in them were considered to be property, not much different than a horse or a mule. This is where slaves were buried. Hello, my name is Marcus Lloyd.
And I'm Michelle Renee. We thank you for joining us. If you are African American, you and I will always be connected to the people whose bodies lie in that cemetery. Our ancestors may have worked alongside of them in the same cotton fields. They could have been bought and sold at the same auction houses or had chains hammered around their necks by the same overseer. Some of them may have even been hunted down by the same slave catcher or whipped by the same master.
For almost 250 years, our people were held in bondage. And today, this period of history has come to be known by an ancient Swahili word. It's called the Maafa. And it began when the first Africans were shackled to the bottom of a slave ship. But the irony is that it did not end when the slaves were freed. In fact, it hasn't ended yet. And as you're about to see, a hidden racial agenda is keeping the Maafa alive into the 21st century.
What shall be done with the 4 million slaves if they are emancipated? This question has been answered and can be answered in many ways. Primarily, it is a question less for man than for God, less for human intellect than for the laws of nature to solve. Our answer is, do nothing with them. Mind your business and let them mind theirs. Your doing with them is their greatest misfortune. They have been undone by your doings, and all they now ask and really have need of at your hands is just to let them alone. Frederick Douglass, 1862.
It is the stupidity of man to think that he can do evil, even some monstrous evil, and it won't have any backlash on himself. But of course, it seldom works that way, and the moment he figures that out, he starts looking for a way to avoid the repercussions of what he's done. This is what happened with slavery. In the early 1800s, as it began to look like the end of slavery might be on the horizon, white America started to be concerned that a day of reckoning was coming. The primary fear for the average person was of retribution and insurrection, and that was a reasonable fear. After all, it's illogical to think that you can do to a whole group of people what was done to African Americans and think that they will just take it lying down forever. And of course, there were things like the Nat Turner uprisings. But for the wealthy elite, their fears went beyond things like insurrection. They were worried about the financial impact. Remember, it was not just the cotton plantations that profited from slavery. Whether you're talking about the banks or the insurance companies, the railroads, even the newspapers, the fact is that almost every aspect of the American economy was at some level or another invested in the slave business. You also need to recognize that for the wealthy elitist who controlled this system, slaves were an asset as long as they were slaves. But at the moment they are set free, they become a liability. And what the elite knew was that the end of slavery would instantly release 4 million people into the economy who had been kept uneducated and effectively unemployable anywhere but the cotton field. And what they were concerned about was that this was going to bankrupt the American economy. Taxes were going to go through the roof to take care of these people. Crime was going to be rampant. The prisons were going to be flooded. There was going to be this population overrun. And in the North, the biggest fear was migration from the South of these black people. The other fear that these people had was intermarriage between blacks and whites would lead to a loss of racial purity. The question was, what were they going to do about it? And their initial thought was that they would just send all the slaves back to Africa. This plan was called colonization, and it had broad support among the wealthy elite. In fact, the American Colonization Society was even funded by the United States Congress. But in the end, colonization proved to be unworkable, and the idea was eventually scrapped. But about that same time, a new philosophy was emerging in the world. It was called eugenics, and for some, it seemed like the perfect solution to what had become known as the Negro dilemma.
I do not join in the belief that the African is our equal in brain or in heart. And I believe that if we can, in any fair way, possess ourselves of his services, we have an equal right to utilize them to our advantage. Francis Galton, 1857.
Francis Galton is known as the father of eugenics. He actually coined the phrase eugenics. So he believed in trying to increase those he felt were superior in stock and decrease those he felt were inferior. Francis Galton came from a very wealthy family, a family that made its wealth from the slave trade. And what a lot of people don't know is that Francis Galton was a cousin to Charles Darwin. Francis Galton took Charles Darwin's philosophies and ideas and thoughts, and he actually put them into practice, and that's what we know today as eugenics. Eugenics and evolution are related in that they both see what they consider to be the highest form of primate, such as the gorilla, as almost indistinguishable from what they consider the lowest form of human, the African and the Aborigine.
At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Charles Darwin, 1890.
Charles Darwin is very well known for writing The Origin of Species in the 1800s. This book gave rise to evolutionary theory. What people don't know is that there was actually a longer original title to this book, and that was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, copies and editions that they made afterwards eliminated that phrase about the favored races. Evidently, they understood then that it was politically incorrect.
Some may defend Francis Galton because eventually that he rejected slavery, but they do point out that all of his wealth did derive from the slave trade, but also it needs to be known that he, as well as other eugenists, did not reject slavery until after it had ended, and they could not any longer exploit blacks legally. So at that point, it would have been quite easy for he and his cohorts to reject slavery. I think this is a point that we all have to really realize, that the eugenics movement was not invented by the everyday average white American, but by a select group of wealthy white elitists that had often used this ideology to pit all of white America against black America. And so we see that indeed that truly is the case even to this day.
Average Negroes possess too little intellect, self-reliance, and self-control to make it possible for them to sustain the burden of any respectable form of civilization without a large measure of external guidance and support. Francis Galton, 1873.
Eugenicists believed that Africans were inferior not just mentally, but physically, and that left to themselves, left alone, they would not make it. The problem is, it didn't work. With that failure, the eugenicists moved on to what is known as positive eugenics. In positive eugenics, the eugenicists wanted the white population to reproduce, to have so many children that it overwhelmed the black population. But that didn't work either. Next, they moved on to what they called negative eugenics. They knew that they could not round up all the blacks in the nation and execute them, so they decided to create an environment where they would convince the blacks to severely limit the number of children they were going to have, and thereby commit race suicide.
The problem of the socially fit must be treated not as one of color, but as a problem of the spread of feeble-mindedness. Dr. Charles Davenport, 1913, director of the Eugenics Record Office, Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and co-founder of the American Eugenics Society.
Eugenics realized that they could not promote their agenda simply because they knew it would be viewed as politically incorrect and socially unacceptable. So what they did was use code words that were once successful in slavery, terms such as feeble-minded, unfit, words such as imbecile, immoral, criminal. They tagged those labels upon the targeted community. These words were less inflammatory, so it let society more or less not be totally alarmed of the original intent, but deep down inside, I believe everyone truly knew what segment of society and what people they were actually talking about.
Even a cursory glance at the charts, photographs, and diagrams used to popularize eugenic ideals reveals that the unfit were swarthy, black, and ugly by Anglo-Saxon standards, with flattened noses, wiry hair, and prognathous profiles. Harriet Washington, author, Medical Apartheid.
In the early 20th century, the white elitists who made up the eugenics movement were no longer just philosophers and academics. Now they were industrialists and billionaires who had come to embrace a worldview that was essentially identical to the eugenics movement. The same individuals and corporations who had once made millions on the backs of slaves were now willing to spend millions to get rid of them. But that didn't mean that these guys were interested in being public crusaders for the eugenics movement. They were certainly willing to be the brains and the money behind it, but they would hire crusaders to do the dirty work. And the primary one they settled upon was a woman named Margaret Sanger. She was the founder of the American Birth Control League and the publisher of its newsletter, the Birth Control Review. On a practical level, the relationship between Sanger and these elitists was basically a marriage of convenience. In order to advance their common agendas, they needed a front man and she needed money. And the whole thing would be held together by this kind of bizarre obsession with race and class. The result was that the American Birth Control League became the driving force behind the American eugenics movement. Eugenics would no longer just be a philosophy. Sanger and others like her were going to put it into practice.
We are paying for and even submitting to the dictates of an ever-increasing, unceasingly spawning class of human beings who never should have been born at all. Margaret Sanger, 1922.
The laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race. Madison Grant, 1916, co-founder, American Eugenics Society.
The black man has never been a competitor, but has always been subservient to the white race. And just so long as he remains subservient, his position is secure. And just so soon as he becomes a competitor, his fate is sealed. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, eugenicist, 1905.
The American Birth Control League was wise enough to get their program of population control across by using what had worked in the past, the same code words that had established the institution of slavery and that was also used by the early eugenics movement was once again used by the American Birth Control League. The Margaret Sangers of those days did not come out and say they were trying to eliminate black people. What they did say, they were trying to rid society of the feeble-minded. They were trying to rid the society of the criminal. Well, she was successful simply because of her eugenics friends for the past 50 years had put those labels on minorities and African Americans, and therefore society was more or less desensitized. In effect, the code words hid the agenda of Margaret Sanger and the eugenists. At that time, they did shift over to what they called the quality of life. It was a philosophy unquestionably used to target the poor simply because what the quality of life at its core meaning was that poor people really didn't have a reason to live. Only the white, those with status, had any chance of a meaningful or purposeful life. The solution for the poor now was not to eliminate the circumstances that would cause poverty. Their solution now was to eliminate the poor, eliminate the impoverished, and just wipe them off the face of the earth.
The practice of birth control among the majority of colored people would probably be more eugenic than among their white compatriots. The dissemination of the information of birth control should have begun with this class, rather than with the upper social and economic classes of white citizens. Walter Turpening, Birth Control Review, 1932.
In virtually every community where Negroes dwell, one finds them in fat times and lean alike, contributing a disproportionate number to the roles of the dependents and delinquents. They make excessive demands on the white man's charity and overtax his patients. Newell Sims, Birth Control Review, 1932.
Author Madison Grant was a co-founder of the American Eugenics Society and an officer of the New York Zoological Society. In 1906, he had authorized an exhibit at the Bronx Zoo in which a 22-year-old African named Ota Benga was displayed in a cage in the monkey house. Sharing the cage with Benga was an orangutan.
When a local clergyman protested the exhibit, he said that it was clearly intended to be a demonstration of Darwin's theory of evolution. Local proponents of Darwinism apparently agreed and labeled the display educational. 10 years after this event, Ota Benga committed suicide.
During Hitler's regime, the Germans were supplied with elaborate charts and complicated theses supposedly proving the superiority of the German people. It is interesting to note that at the bottom of these charts were the colored people of the world, most conspicuously, the black people. Floyd McKissick, National Director, Congress of Racial Equality, 1967.
An often overlooked fact about the German Holocaust is that the Nazis did not simply target the Jewish population. They went after the black community as well. Under the threat of being sent to concentration camps if they did not cooperate, Afro-German citizens were not only forced to undergo sterilization themselves, they were also required to turn over their children for sterilization. In his book Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler explained the motivation behind such programs.
The Jews were responsible for bringing Negroes into the Rhineland. It suits the purpose of the cool, calculating Jew who would use this means of introducing a process of bastardization in the very center of the European continent, and, by infecting the white race with the blood of an inferior stock, would destroy the foundations of its independent existence. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf.
The Nazi attitude toward blacks was clearly defined in a 1944 book by Robert Ley, who was the head of the German Labor Front. Ley characterized the Jewish race as a disease-riddled parasite that had been created by unnatural inbreeding between white men and the racially inferior Negro. He described the result as a racial swamp that would eventually destroy the natural superiority of the Aryan race. Another Nazi publication described blacks as African brutes who had not been tamed even by centuries of slavery. It went on to say that any effort to assimilate people of African descent into civilized society was a waste of time, and that the lynchings of blacks in America did not merit any regret.
Since World War II, it has been well documented that Adolf Hitler was profoundly influenced by the American eugenics movement, and that many of his government's racial policies were actually developed from the writings of American eugenicists, like Madison Grant and Harry Laughlin. In fact, Hitler referred to Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, as his Bible.
Meanwhile, American eugenicists were routinely praising Hitler and holding up the Nazi eugenics program as a model for the United States to copy.
The leader of the German nation, Adolf Hitler, has been able to construct a comprehensive racial policy of population development and improvement. The difference between the Jew and the Aryan is as unsurmountable as that between black and white. Germany has set a pattern which other nations must follow. Dr. Clarence Gordon Campbell, 1935, President, Eugenics Research Association, New York.
Among those American eugenicists who most strongly supported the Nazis was a member of the American Eugenics Society, a director of the American Birth Control League, and a writer for the Birth Control Review. His name was Lothrop Stoddard.
As an avowed racist, Stoddard was the author of a book called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, which was widely promoted by the Ku Klux Klan. In another book, The Dragon and the Cross, Stoddard was identified as the exalted Cyclops of the Massachusetts chapter of the Klan.
Non-white races must be excluded from America. The red and black races, if left to themselves, revert to a savage or semi-savage state in a short time. Lothrop Stoddard, Director, American Birth Control League.
On the 19th of December, 1939, during a 4-month stay in Germany, Stoddard was given a personal meeting with both Adolf Hitler and the man who would eventually be in charge of the Nazi Holocaust, SS leader Heinrich Himmler.
Later, when a course on race was introduced at Halle University in Germany, its instructor stated that it would be modeled on the philosophies of American eugenicists, including Lothrop Stoddard. Eventually, Stoddard's racial views would even be featured in Nazi school textbooks.
The white race divides into 3 main subspecies: the Nordics, the Alpines, and the Mediterraneans. All 3 are good stocks, ranking in genetic worth well above the various colored races. Lothrop Stoddard, Director, American Birth Control League.
To eliminate blacks from Germany, one of the people Hitler called on was a eugenicist who had once written that blacks are an inferior race of savages who should only be allowed to survive as long as they are of use to the Aryan race. His name was Eugen Fischer, and about 20 years earlier, he had been one of the leaders of a system of concentration camps in southwestern Africa, where blacks were rounded up to be executed, experimented on, or held as free labor. Under Hitler, Fischer would serve on committees that planned the sterilization of all blacks in countries that came under German control. He would also be one of the first Nazi scientists to become publicly affiliated with the Carnegie-funded Eugenics Laboratory in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. Eventually, Fischer would also be put in charge of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. It was here that many of the Nazi programs for creating racial purity were developed.
In 1927, Margaret Sanger organized the World Population Conference in Geneva, Switzerland, and gave it front-page coverage in her Birth Control Review. The events program shows that several of its attendees were colleagues of Sanger's from the American Eugenics movement. It also documents that among those who were given a leadership role in the conference was Eugen Fischer, the man who would eventually lead the Nazi effort to eradicate blacks from Europe.
Another American eugenicist with Nazi connections was Harry Laughlin. Now, he was an official with both the American Eugenics Society and the American Birth Control League, and in 1928 his plan for using forced sterilization to eliminate those who might produce what he called degenerate offspring was published in the Birth Control Review. In 1936, Laughlin led an effort to distribute the English language version of a Nazi eugenics film to audiences in the northeastern part of the United States. He had acquired the rights to the film from the Race Policy Office of the Nazi Party and, with the help of 2 other American eugenics organizations, had mailed literature to biology teachers at 3,000 U.S. high schools, urging them to show it in their classrooms. Later that year, Laughlin was praised in a Nazi newspaper and awarded an honorary degree from the University of Heidelberg for his contributions to the Nazi eugenics effort.
In the 1930s, a German psychiatrist named Ernst Rudin was named president of the International Federation of Eugenics in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, which was funded by the Carnegie Corporation. And in 1933, his call for racial purity was published in the Birth Control Review.
Later, Rudin would be chosen by Hitler to write Germany's eugenics laws, and at one point, he personally helped the Gestapo round up and sterilize several hundred blacks, who they referred to as Rhineland bastards. After the war, Rudin would be identified as one of the architects of the barbaric medical experiments that the Nazis carried out in their concentration camps.
It may be possible that Hitler actually got the idea for concentration camps while studying the American eugenics movement. In 1919, the state of Indiana had allocated $300,000 to create a work colony in the city of Butlerville, where those who were labeled feeble-minded would be incarcerated. Then in 1932, Margaret Sanger called for the United States government to set aside farms and open spaces where certain groups of people would be segregated from the rest of society. She proposed that, among others, the illiterate, the unemployed, and the poor should be forcibly kept in these areas until they developed what she called better moral conduct.
It was later discovered that under the Indiana program, the state was allowed to label someone feeble-minded if they were poor or did not do well in school, or if the state considered them to be shiftless or have insufficient moral judgment. But it's important to understand that this Indiana campaign was not unlike those in other states. For example, a eugenics project conducted in Massachusetts during the late 1920s proposed sterilization for young girls who were diagnosed as defective, which could include being unwed and pregnant, financially poor, or if the state labeled them socially undesirable. In addition, boys as young as 14 could be castrated for showing signs of kleptomania or for exhibiting what was described as solitary behavior.
In a single incident during 1935, the Nazis sterilized the children of over 600 German women because it was reported that those children had been fathered by black men.
When news of this reached the United States, a member of the American Eugenics Society named Walter Ashby Plecker wrote a letter to the German Bureau of Human Betterment and Eugenics, praising them for the action and expressing his hope that not one child had been missed. 10 years earlier, Plecker had written that the black population was the greatest problem and most destructive force which confronts the white race and American civilization.
Eugenics goals are most likely attained under a name other than eugenics. Frederick Osborne, president and founding member of the American Eugenics Society.
By the late 1930s and early 1940s, revelations about Nazi and fascist atrocities in Europe were causing the public to become increasingly uncomfortable with terms like eugenics and population control. This alarmed the leaders of the American Birth Control League, who were aware that this shifting attitude could impact both their ability to implement their racial agenda and their ability to raise funds. They were also aware that the connections between the American Birth Control League and the Nazis were starting to become known. Marketing research had shown them that in this environment, they needed to move away from words like control in favor of less threatening words like planning. So in 1942, they changed the name of the organization. From then on, the American Birth Control League would officially be known as Planned Parenthood.
The important thing to understand here is that this name change did not change the organization's agenda. The same people were still in control, they were still obsessed with race, and they were still dedicated to eugenics. Today, defenders of Margaret Sanger will often try to hide her racism by claiming that she was not really a eugenicist and that Planned Parenthood was never part of the eugenics movement. But the truth is that as late as 1956, the American Eugenics Society listed Sanger as a member of the organization. In addition, many of Sanger's colleagues and the people whose writings she published, as well as many of Planned Parenthood's officers, were also known to be members.
In fact, the ties between Sanger and the eugenics movement were so well established that in the 1920s, Sanger pursued a plan to merge the American Birth Control League, or Planned Parenthood as it was later called, with the American Eugenics Society. However, despite Sanger's efforts, the merger plan died after being rejected by the leadership of the American Eugenics Society. As an alternative, Sanger then proposed that the two organizations at least combine their publications into one magazine. But again, that idea was also rejected by the American Eugenics Society.
The eugenic and civilization value of birth control is becoming apparent to the enlightened and the intelligent. The campaign for birth control is not merely of eugenic value, but is practically identical in ideal with the final aim of eugenics. Margaret Sanger, 1921.
In her autobiography, Margaret Sanger wrote about a speech she gave in 1926 at a Ku Klux Klan rally in Silver Lake, New Jersey. The Planned Parenthood founder bragged about the fact that afterward, she was invited by 12 other Klan chapters to speak at their events.
At about the same time the American Birth Control League was changing its name to Planned Parenthood, a lot of books and reports began coming out that attempted to put a happy face on eugenics, and many of them were written by people that were associated with Planned Parenthood. The strategy here was obvious. Since the Nazis had turned eugenics into a four-letter word, the American eugenics movement decided it was time to lay low. So most of their writings during this time period downplayed the role of eugenics and couched their agenda in terms of helping the African American. Perhaps the best example of this is a 1,500-page book by eugenicist Gunnar Myrdal called An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy. Interestingly, this book was not the result of some mom-and-pop operation. Myrdal had 75 assistants working on this project whose salaries were being paid for by the Carnegie Corporation, and Carnegie had been a major player in the eugenics movement for many years.
Gunnar Myrdal and his wife Alva were both involved in eugenics. They were funded by both the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation. They were also closely linked to a Swedish eugenics program which forcibly sterilized 66,000 people. When you read Chapter 7 of this book, it becomes undeniable that this is a blueprint for the modern eugenics movement that we still see in the United States today. The bottom line is that Gunnar Myrdal believed that not only could blacks not help themselves, he felt that nobody could help them, and the only solution in his eyes was to get rid of them.
Commonly, it is considered a great misfortune for America that Negro slaves were ever imported. The presence of Negroes in America today is usually considered a plight of the nation. Chapter 7, page 167. All white Americans agree that if the Negro is to be eliminated, he must be eliminated slowly, so as not to hurt any living individual Negroes. Chapter 7, page 168. The only way possible of decreasing Negro population is by means of controlling fertility. Chapter 7, page 170. Birth control facilities could be extended relatively more to Negroes than to whites, since Negroes are more concentrated in the lower income and education classes. Chapter 7, page 176.
One thing I find very revealing about Chapter 7 is the first paragraph. Myrdal uses U.S. Census Bureau figures to show that between 1790 and 1940, the black population in the United States increased 17 times. At the same time, those Census Bureau figures show that the white population increased 37 times. However, neither Myrdal nor any other eugenicist wrote anything about what to do about that part of the population that was increasing twice as fast as the black population.
Gunnar Myrdal's book on how to resolve what he called the Negro Problem was published in 1944 by Harper & Brothers of New York. 4 years earlier, the same company, which is today known as HarperCollins, had also published a book by one of the founding members of the American Eugenics Society. At the time that Harper & Brothers published these books, its president was a man named Cass Canfield, who would later become the national president of Planned Parenthood.
We hope that the restraint of population growth can come about through voluntary means. But if it does not, involuntary methods will be used. Dr. Donald Minkler, 1972.
Donald Minkler was the president of the American Association of Planned Parenthood Physicians and a member of the board of directors of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Like many of those in the eugenics movement, he understood that their plans would not always be voluntarily adopted, and that the use of governmental coercion or even force might one day be necessary.
The idea of forced eugenics was not something that suddenly developed in the 1970s. In a 1929 speech, American eugenicist Samuel Holmes had proposed that mandatory birth control should be used as a tool to eliminate what he called the menace to the white race that had been created by increases in black population. His solution was to have a quota system in which the right to have a child would be controlled by the government and determined by race. At the time, Holmes was on the National Council of the American Birth Control League, which would later become known as Planned Parenthood.
Then, in 1936, eugenicist Julian Huxley proposed that the genetically inferior classes could be made to have fewer children if they were denied easy access to welfare. Another part of this proposal was that medical care to these same people should be restricted in order to reduce the survival rates of the children they did have. He also called for the forced sterilization of anyone who was unemployed beyond a certain length of time. Huxley was later honored by Planned Parenthood and was a featured speaker at one of their annual conventions.
The reality is that the views of people like Samuel Holmes and Julian Huxley were never uncommon within the American eugenics community. In 1969, a professor at the University of California, Dr. Garrett Hardin, called it insanity to rely on voluntarism to control population. Hardin was a member of the American Eugenics Society and an outspoken advocate of government-enforced birth control, saying that citizens should be willing to give up their right to breed for the betterment of society. In 1980, he was given Planned Parenthood's highest national award. He and his wife would later kill themselves in a joint suicide pact.
There were, of course, some within the eugenics movement who were uncomfortable with the idea of using force, and they would often express their reservations about it in public. But when pressed, virtually none of them would rule it out, including Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger.
I consider that the world and almost our civilization for the next 25 years is going to depend upon a simple, cheap, safe contraceptive to be used in poverty-stricken slums, jungles, and among the most ignorant people. Even this will not be sufficient, because I believe that now, immediately, there should be national sterilization for certain dysgenic types of our population who are being encouraged to breed and would die out were the government not feeding them. Margaret Sanger, 1950.
This was written by Sanger in a personal letter to Catherine Dexter McCormick. McCormick was an heir to the international harvester fortune and would later use part of her immense wealth to fund the development of the birth control pill.
In 1966, an example of the coercive power of state eugenics laws was seen in Maryland when 3 young mothers applied for welfare benefits. All 3 were arrested for child neglect, even though the authorities never claimed to have any evidence of abuse or neglect. Instead, the women were held under a state law which stated that simply being unmarried and pregnant was child neglect. The judge in this case warned the women that if they ever became pregnant again, the state would take custody of all their children. Officials in Prince George's County, where the arrest took place, stated that welfare recipients could avoid being prosecuted under this law by submitting to state-sponsored birth control education.
In 1934, Adolf Hitler sent a letter to American eugenicist Leon Whitney, complimenting him for a book he had written on sterilization. Whitney was the former executive secretary of the American Eugenics Society and a colleague of Margaret Sanger's. Sanger also published his writings in the Birth Control Review.
In the book that Hitler was praising, Whitney had written that America could eliminate what he called the slum elements of society by sterilizing the lowest 25% of its population. He claimed this was necessary because such people are too stupid to understand or practice even simple methods of contraception. Besides, he said, the country would hardly miss them. One of the people he was talking about was named Elaine Riddick.
At the age of 13, I became pregnant. I was raped by a guy that lived across the street from me. He snatched me off the street and molested me and threatened my life and said if I ever told anyone that he would kill me. When they was delivering my son, they sterilized me at the same time. They had approached my grandmother and said that if she wanted to continue to receive supplement, welfare and food stamps, or at this time they was giving out these surplus foods, canned cheese, I think it was, powdered eggs, and said that if she did not sign the X, that they were going to stop her supplements. Mind you, my grandmother was illiterate. She had never ever gone to school. She didn't understand what it was. So she signed the X and they did this to me. I did not find out that they had sterilized me until I was 19 years old. I asked the state of North Carolina why they did this to me, and they said that because I was feeble-minded, that I would not be able to take care of myself, I would not be able to tie my shoes, that I was just incompetent. The state of North Carolina also said that I had never performed, at the age of 13, I had never performed a day's work in my life. They couldn't get me to do anything. But at the age of 13, I mean, should I not have been in school? They were saying that feeble-mindedness is hereditary. So they sterilized me so I would not produce my kind. Mind you, I am not illiterate, nor am I feeble-minded. I never went into high school, but yet I still acquired a college degree. They also justified that my child or my children would be feeble-minded. My son is the president of his own semiconductor company. He has his own construction company. And he has his own real estate company. I mean, how can you think that your government allowed or allowing these things to happen to a person, a life? You can't say nothing, you have no rights. To me, they took away all of my rights. They sterilized kids from, my understanding and my knowledge, as young as 8 years of age. I don't know what an 8-year-old can do that could cause them to do this to them. The only reason I can give myself is that because they're black.
In 1961, social worker Sue Casebolt had been installed as the executive secretary of the North Carolina Eugenics Board. At a board meeting held 3 weeks later, she stated that she was going to keep a file on every child whose name reached her desk so that they could be picked up as soon as they reached childbearing age. Casebolt was still on the board in 1968 when it approved the sterilization of 14-year-old Elaine Riddick.
It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility,
Society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Oliver Wendell Holmes, U.S. Supreme Court Justice, 1927.
Holmes made this statement in his ruling on the constitutionality of Virginia's forced sterilization law. It mirrored the views of President Theodore Roosevelt, who had originally appointed Holmes to the Supreme Court. In a 1913 letter to American Eugenics Society founder Charles Davenport, Roosevelt had stated that the country had no business allowing citizens of the wrong type to reproduce.
In 1907, Indiana had become the first of more than 30 states to pass sterilization laws, and some of those laws stayed on the books well into the 1970s. In fact, the state of Oregon did its last sterilization in 1981 and did not abolish its eugenics board until October of 1983.
Some states practice sterilization without ever creating an official eugenics board. In those instances, few if any records were kept, and in the states that did keep records, many have never been made available to the public. But in just those states that have released their records, it is known that at least 60,000 Americans were sterilized, and they were disproportionately black. In addition, during a 1973 lawsuit, a federal judge estimated that as many as 150,000 additional low-income women may have been sterilized under federal programs alone. These sterilizations were often performed without the patient's knowledge or consent, and sometimes against their will. It was also common for social workers to tell welfare recipients that they would lose their benefits if they did not agree to be sterilized. In some cases, poor families were even threatened with the loss of welfare unless they brought their children in for sterilization. The result was that some of the people sterilized were as young as 10 years old.
In the first 6 months of 1972, one hospital in Aiken County, South Carolina, sterilized over 1/3 of the Medicaid patients who were there to give birth, and all but one of these women were black. One patient said she was told by all 3 of the county's obstetricians that they would not deliver her baby unless she agreed to be sterilized. Her claim was later confirmed by each of the doctors. Another patient said she was told by one of these same physicians that he was tired of having to help support the babies of welfare recipients and that she could either agree to be sterilized or find another doctor.
The law of nature says that only the fit shall survive. When a nation disregards this law by protecting the unfit and encouraging their multiplication, this nation invites inevitable destruction. As far as New Jersey is concerned, sterilization is an economic necessity. And as far as the United States is concerned, sterilization is a matter of national preservation. Fred Shepard, Assemblyman.
Fred Shepard was a member of the New Jersey State Legislature. He made this statement upon his introduction of a sterilization bill in March of 1942.
In some parts of the country, Planned Parenthood was closely associated with these state eugenics boards and was often a referral agency for them. But the system did not always run smoothly. In 1969, when the number of sterilizations approved by the Iowa State Eugenics Board began to drop, the board was attacked in the press by the executive director of Planned Parenthood, Robert Weber. He said that he was alarmed by the decline in numbers and that the Eugenics Board should expand its approval criteria. Board Chairman Dr. S.M. Corson responded that the board's guidelines were already fairly broad. He pointed out that approvals were routinely given for young girls for no reason other than the board's speculation that they might likely one day engage in immoral behavior without the capacity for being wives and mothers. At that point, Weber publicly scolded the board and told them that they should either increase the number of sterilizations or quit.
From its beginning, Planned Parenthood always had powerful ties to the American eugenics community. In fact, in many places they were often one and the same. For example, when the first birth control clinic was opened in Arkansas, it was operated by the Arkansas Eugenics Association and overseen by a woman named Hilda Cornish. Later, the Arkansas Eugenics Association would become the Arkansas State Affiliate, of Planned Parenthood, and Cornish would be named its executive director.
During the 4 months that American Birth Control League director Lothrop Stoddard was in Nazi Germany, he not only met with Hitler and SS chief Heinrich Himmler, he also attended one of the Nazi eugenics courts.
The first case I saw looked like an excellent candidate for sterilization. A man in his mid-30s, he was rather ape-like in appearance. Receding forehead, flat nose with flaring nostrils, thick lips, and heavy prognathous jaw. Not vicious looking, but gross and rather dull. Lothrop Stoddard, Director, American Birth Control League, later known as Planned Parenthood.
Given the admiration that Adolf Hitler expressed for the American eugenics movement, it is not unlikely that he modeled the eugenics courts in Nazi Germany after the state eugenics boards in the U.S. In both countries, feeble-mindedness was routinely used as a catch-all justification for sterilization, and the diagnosis of feeble-mindedness was almost always left up to the judgment of the person advocating the sterilization.
First, the white man tells me to sit in the back of the bus. Now it looks like he wants me to sleep under the bed. Back in the days of slavery, black folks couldn't grow kids fast enough for white folks to harvest. Now that we got a little taste of power, white folks wants to call a moratorium on having babies. Comedian Dick Gregory, Ebony Magazine, 1971.
By the 1960s, the American eugenics movement had been reasonably successful in getting sterilization laws and prohibitions against interracial marriage passed. They also had some success in getting states to mandate sterilization for those convicted of even non-sexual crimes, and some states began to require sterilization as a condition for receiving welfare or health care. Meanwhile, another state proposed jail time for anyone who had a child out of wedlock unless they agreed to be sterilized, and at least one state requires sterilization as a condition of being released from custody.
But these laws were not producing the results Planned Parenthood and others in the eugenics movement wanted. They also began to fear that federal courts were going to eventually rule that these kinds of measures were unconstitutional. At about the same time, however, something new was being introduced to American society. It was called the birth control pill, and the eugenics movement quickly saw it as the perfect solution for controlling the population of people they had always seen as oversexed, unsophisticated, and lazy. But what they would eventually discover is that while the pill was enthusiastically embraced by whites, it was generally rejected by blacks, despite the fact that Planned Parenthood focused its marketing on the African American community and located the vast majority of its facilities in black neighborhoods.
What Planned Parenthood and the rest of the eugenics movement did not count on was that many blacks did not want to reduce their numbers. In fact, they saw high birth rates as the most effective way to increase their power in the American political system. The other reality was that an increasing number of African Americans were becoming suspicious that a hidden agenda was behind the birth control revolution. Even those who once supported the idea of population control were beginning to sense that it actually meant black population control. This feeling was evident in June of 1970 when the Black Caucus walked out of the first National Congress on Optimum Population and Environment being held in Chicago. Felton Alexander of the National Urban League and the chairman of the Black Caucus said the action was taken because of clear and unmistakable evidence that the purpose of the conference was to legitimize the extermination of the black population. By this time, many other civil rights advocates were beginning to see the same thing.
Contraceptives will become a form of drug warfare against the helpless in this nation. Jesse Jackson, 1971.
There is a campaign to bombard the poor with pills and potions. If this movement continues, we soon may be accused of fighting poverty by eliminating the poor and overcoming hunger by removing the hungry. New York Congressman Hugh Carey, 1966.
Under the cover of an alleged campaign to alleviate poverty, white supremacist Americans and their dupes are pushing an all-out drive to put rigid birth control measures into every black home. No such drive exists within the white American world. Black Unity Party, 1968.
Birth control and sterilization in the wrong hands would be more deadly to Negroes than all the tanks, riot guns, cattle prods, billy clubs, and shackles we have overcome in the past. Dr. Leroy Swift, obstetrician, gynecologist, 1968.
As it became clear that a growing number of African Americans were connecting the dots between birth control and black genocide, eugenics organizations began calling for the U.S. government to add birth control chemicals to the nation's food and water supply. It was even suggested that this strategy could be specifically targeted at urban neighborhoods. This idea was widely embraced in the eugenics movement and taken seriously enough by the government to be discussed at a 1969 meeting at the United Nations. Under the plan being considered, a couple could apply to the government for permission to have a child, and if approved, they would be given an antidote to the population control chemicals they had ingested in their food and water. Interestingly, the idea that government should have some sort of licensing agreement to regulate who would and would not be allowed to give birth was not a new one. In 1934, Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger had proposed that the U.S. government implement a system in which women would not have the legal right to have a child without a permit from the government, and that these permits would only be good for one baby.
But eventually, proposals like forced sterilization, chemicals in the food and water supply, and government control of childbearing were abandoned by most people in the eugenics movement. Despite the fact that many of them openly advocated such ideas, they would come to realize that there was really no practical way to carry them out. But for all their failures, what the eugenics movement had accomplished was to lay the foundation for the next phase of their plan. And this is where they would find the success that they had been chasing for over 100 years.
What would you say is now the #1 cause of death in the African American community?
Heart disease.
Oh, HIV/AIDS.
Diabetes, cancer, AIDS.
I'll say heart disease.
AIDS.
From what I heard, it's probably AIDS, you know.
Probably heart disease.
I think heart disease.
HIV. Gang violence.
What if I told you the real answer was abortion?
Since 1973, legal abortion has killed more African Americans than AIDS, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and violent crime combined. Every week, more blacks die in American abortion clinics than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. And the largest chain of abortion clinics in the United States is operated by Planned Parenthood.
We have now reached a point in this country that African American women, though they make up 12% of the population, they account for 37% of the abortions. An African American baby is almost 5 times more likely to be aborted than a white child. The abortion industry at this point kills as many African American people every 4 days as the Klan killed in 150 years. And you can truly say the most dangerous place for an African American to be is in the womb of their African American mother.
All across America, you can stand outside of the abortion clinics and see a steady stream of black women coming in and out. But somewhere along the way, we got the idea that this is a white issue or a conservative issue or a Republican issue, and therefore it's not an issue that we have to be concerned about. This same attitude has allowed Planned Parenthood and other members of the abortion industry to carry out this genocide right under our very noses. Right now in America, about half of our babies are being killed in the womb. And in certain parts of America, more of our babies are being aborted than are being born.
When 17,000 aborted babies were found in a dumpster outside of a pathology laboratory in Los Angeles, California, some 12 to 15,000 were observed to be black. Irma Clardy Craven, Chairman, Minneapolis Commission on Human Rights and Secretary of the Urban League.
To understand what the agenda was behind the legalization of abortion, all you need to do is look at the statistics from the U.S. government. Studies from the CDC show that prior to the legalization of abortion, approximately 80% of all illegal abortions were done on white women. One study in New York even found that white women had 5 times as many abortions as black women. But at the moment abortion became legal, that began to reverse. And that's why the legalization of abortion was so crucial for the eugenics movement. Legalization created the ability to market abortion in the black community. And from a eugenics standpoint, that changed everything.
These people cannot have it both ways. First, they say that birth control will reduce the number of abortions. Then they flood our neighborhoods with birth control clinics. And what's the result? Our abortion rate skyrockets. So either they lied about the fact that birth control would reduce abortions in our neighborhoods, or this is the results and the purpose they wanted from the beginning. At this point, I truly have the tendency to believe the latter.
In 1973, the year abortion was legalized nationwide, Dr. Christopher Tizzi produced a study on abortion demographics at the request of the Population Council, a New York-based eugenics organization. In this report, Tizzi confirmed previous research showing that when abortion is illegal, the abortion rate is much higher for white women than for black women, but that this completely reverses whenever abortion is legalized. At the time he published these findings, Tizzi was a consultant to both Planned Parenthood and the National Abortion Federation.
Other researchers within the eugenics and abortion movements were also documenting that easy access to abortion clinics produces higher abortion rates in the surrounding area. And at least one expert discovered that having a nearby clinic is a bigger factor in the black abortion rate than it is in the white abortion rate. At the same time this data is being circulated, Planned Parenthood and the rest of the abortion lobby were in the process of locating the vast majority of their facilities in minority neighborhoods. Then in 1974, a study was released on population control that had been conducted by researchers at 3 major universities. By analyzing data obtained from Planned Parenthood's own records, they determined that the #1 factor in deciding whether a county in the United States provided free or low-cost family planning services was not poverty, but race. The researchers said their findings seemed to support the contention of many civil rights activists that such programs are less intended to assist the poor than they are to control the growth of the black population.
Birth control and abortion are turning out to be the great eugenic advances of our time. Frederick Osborne, founding member of the American Eugenics Society, 1973.
The best way to hate a nigger is to hate him before he is born. Leander Perez, Louisiana State Judge, 1970.
2 years after the director of Iowa Planned Parenthood had publicly attacked the state's eugenics board for not approving enough sterilizations, a bill was introduced in the Iowa legislature to legalize abortion. Despite having the support of both the state Republican Party and the state Democratic Party, as well as strong backing from the governor, the bill would be defeated almost single-handedly by the only African American in the Iowa legislature.
Proponents have argued this bill is for blacks and the poor who want abortions and can't afford one. This is the phoniest and most preposterous argument of all. I represent the inner city where the majority of blacks and poor live, and I challenge anyone here to show me a waiting line of either blacks or poor whites who are wanting an abortion. Iowa State Representative June Franklin, Democrat, 1971.
From the beginning, it was obvious that racism was the driving force behind the eugenics movement. While it was true that from time to time these elitist and social engineers would toss a few lower-class whites in among the feeble-minded and worthless who should be bred out of society, it was also true that they never seemed to include blacks among the best and the brightest who should be bred in. And at the same time, the country was being saturated with calls for population control and family planning. The facilities to carry them out were pouring into the black community. After all, no one was suggesting that there were too many white people in the world. And realities like those did not go unnoticed by early civil rights activists. For them, the reason birth control and abortion were being pushed was not a secret.
Those whom we could not get rid of in the rice paddies of Vietnam, we now propose to exterminate if necessary, eliminate if possible, in the OB wards and gynecology clinics of our urban hospitals. Jesse Jackson, 1971.
Black people are the target of birth control, not because the ruling politicians like them and care about their economic equality, but because they hate them and can no longer use them in plantations and other cheap labor conditions. Muhammad Speaks, the Black Muslim newspaper, 1970.
I believe the entire question of abortions is just one more in the continuous series of events to eliminate the black population. Father George Clemens, Jet Magazine, 1973.
The abortion law hides behind the guise of helping women, when in reality it will attempt to destroy our people. Brenda Heisen, New York chapter, Black Panther Party, July 1970.
The racist tells you to take birth control pills to kill, to murder life that might have existed if you had not. They are planning mass extermination of people they consider dispensable. Dan Keyes, Oakland chapter, Black Panther Party, 1969.
A true revolutionary cares about the people. He cares to the point that he is willing to put his life on the line to help the masses of poor and oppressed people. He would never think of killing his unborn child. Detroit chapter, Black Panther Party, 1970.
Who the hell is getting the pill? The Mexican and the Negro. Do you want to wipe us out? Cesar Chavez, 1967.
On the day after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, a memorial service was held at Howard University in Washington, D.C. As mourners left the auditorium, they encountered about 600 people attending a rally outside. Several speakers were heard warning the crowd that population control was being used as a weapon of black genocide. Among the speakers who gave this warning was noted civil rights activist Stokely Carmichael.
A year later, Pittsburgh police were called when 200 sticks of dynamite were discovered near a local Catholic church. An investigation revealed that the dynamite was not intended for the church, but was instead left behind by civil rights activist William Bowie Hayden. Hayden later admitted that he and his group, the United Movement for Progress, had planned to use the explosives to blow up nearby Planned Parenthood facilities because they were practicing black genocide. Hayden had once stated that any African American who supported allowing Planned Parenthood into black neighborhoods was an Uncle Tom.
Into the black community stepped Planned Parenthood. Only when they came into the black community, they've become Planned Black Genocide. William Bowie Hayden, civil rights activist, 1971.
Among those associated with Hayden was an African-American physician named Dr. Charles Greenlee. Greenlee had been a staunch supporter of Planned Parenthood, but became suspicious of the organization after noticing that black neighborhoods in his city were, as he described it, saturated with Planned Parenthood facilities, while nearby white neighborhoods that were just as poor did not have a single one.
In an article published by the Black Muslim newspaper Muhammad Speaks, Greenlee said he had also discovered that deceptive materials were being circulated in the ghettos and delivered to the homes of black women, warning them that welfare recipients who had additional children would lose their public assistance. Greenlee knew that wasn't true and concluded that Planned Parenthood was pushing a hidden agenda. It was then he severed his ties to the organization and started working